Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good middle of the night for those of us who are joining us from Australia. My name is Karina Litvak. I chair the Climate Governance Initiative, and I also was, as a result of joining the board of an oil and gas major 8 years ago, was inspired to work towards the creation of the Climate Governance Initiative, which we have the honor of having collaborated with the World Economic Forum to get off the ground in 2019. So today we are going to introduce to you 3 brilliant thought leadership pieces that were produced for us by Deloitte. I'm going to give you a few of the key takeaways from these 3 reports, and then we will hand over to our brilliant panel, which is composed of Feike Sybesma, the chairman of, oh gosh, I just lost my page, Sheila Murray, chairman of Tech Resources, and Sharon Thorne, chairman of Deloitte. Thank you, Chairman of Philips, Feike, and moderated by Antonia Gavel, who runs climate change for the World Economic Forum. A couple of administrative notes, just so all of you know, you're all on mute. However, please feel free to use the Q&A to enter any questions you have. Antonia will be leading the session with our speakers, and she has prepared a number of questions, but she'll keep an eye on what you're bringing to her attention. And now what I'd like to do is just quickly give you a brief overview of the Climate Governance Initiative. It was created with the goal of enabling and mobilizing non-executive directors around the world to understand the implications, the challenges, the opportunities that are associated with climate change and the climate crisis, giving them the skills that they need to put this at the heart of their board's decision-making and at the heart of their company's strategy. And therefore to establish a presence all over the world. We are now present in 31 countries with chapters in 21 of those. In 2019, as mentioned, we launched the Principles for Effective Climate Governance, which were commissioned by the World Economic Forum, which contain 8 best practice principles that guide board behavior, and they run from the legal responsibilities of board directors to risk management, strategic planning, remuneration, disclosure, exchange with other stakeholders, and so forth. Now, the challenge, having drawn up these really excellent and very challenging principles, is to move to execution. And this is the purpose of these thought leadership pieces, which really dig into the what, the how, the why, the how fast boards need to engage with this topic. And I just want to stress a couple of things. As you know, awareness of the climate challenge has skyrocketed. And the most recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, otherwise known as the IPCC, has stated unequivocally that we need to almost halve our emissions by 2025. That's a very, very challenging order. And that's why it is so imperative for boards to understand fully what's at stake and understand their role in driving their company's strategy and operations going forward. I'd like to now hand over to Olivier Schwab, who's going to give you a brief overview of the work that he is doing with the community of chairpersons of the World Economic Forum, and then I'll pick up again with the key findings from these 3 reports. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karina, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Olivier Schwab. I'm Managing Director at the Forum and working with chairs and CEOs on a variety of topics. And indeed, I think for boards and chairs in particular, the amount of pressure and the amount of topics that they need to deal with at present time is tremendous, from understanding the geopolitical climate, to navigating, of course, 2 years of COVID crisis and the aftermath, reintegrating the workforces, and of course managing their fiduciary duties. One of the topics to add to this list is the topic of climate, and how do chairs and boards steer and drive their company's climate ambitions. This is a work that we've initiated together with Sharon Thorne from Deloitte within our community of chairs. That's a community of 100 chairs of large multinational companies, cross-sector, cross-region, who all have this question: how do we navigate the climate agenda? How do we steer our companies through it? How do we prepare and equip ourselves, understand the challenges, the risk, and how do we ask the right questions to management so that we are well prepared? And these are some of the topics that will be coming out in the thought pieces which we're launching today, and which we're very proud of. Indeed, this ties also to another of our flagship initiatives at the forum, which is the Stakeholder Capitalism Metrics, or the ESG metrics, which is driven by a group of CEOs. So there's a nice correlation and symbiosis, if you will, on driving the climate agenda from a board's lens, but then also understanding the responsibilities of the management, and the two go together. And indeed, over the past 18 months, when we started on this journey, we've made sure to sort of tie these two together. So we're really excited now to have these three thought pieces that we can present to you, and to hear from the chairs themselves. For the work which we're presenting today, we interviewed, I think, 16 or 17 chairs, which gave us quite some insight, and we're going to hear from some of them today. So thank you very much for joining us. Back to you, Karina.
Thank you very much, Olivier, and you've teed me up perfectly, because now I'm going to share with you some of the key findings from these three reports, beginning with the series of interviews, which has some really interesting insights, which I would summarize, if I had to, by saying we still have a long way to go. And I don't say this to discourage everyone, but really just for us to be realistic about the scale of the challenge that lies ahead. The truth of the matter is that many, I would personally say most board directors are still grappling with the basics. They're still trying to understand what climate risk actually is. So there's a real job to do in terms of just educating them about what is transition risk, what is adaptation risk, what is litigation or liability risk, and so forth. There's also, and it's interesting to me, one of the key findings of this report is that the single greatest motivator is still the fear of negative publicity. That's an important concern, without a doubt, but really we need to get directors to engage with the reality of the substance of the climate threat. Interesting thoughts around getting directors to appreciate the why, the how fast. And this how fast is really critical, because oftentimes there's a lack of awareness of the urgency, the complexity, the scale of the challenge that needs to be confronted. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to be all gloom and doom. We do have some very very positive things to take away from this as well, because we also don't want to forget that directors need to tune into the opportunities, and there are definitely opportunities to be had. And I say this, by the way, from personal experience. I serve on the board of an oil and gas major. The definition of an industry that is facing obsolescence, and yet, if done well, this is definitely full of very exciting market opportunities. A couple of points which I personally disagree with in this report, which I'm going to respectfully share with you. The findings are that greenwashing is on the decline. Greenwashing is a risk, but it is on the decline. I would actually nuance that by saying there is a greater awareness of the risk of greenwashing, but and therefore directors are very cautious about overclaiming because that exposes them to accusations of greenwashing. But at the same time, investors have been hammered by accusations of greenwashing in their own products, and that is going to reverberate back onto companies. And secondly, greenwashing is a topic for litigation. And so litigation risk associated with alleged greenwashing is also something that directors need to be mindful of. A second point that is made in here that I thought was very interesting, and I think this really varies from one company to another. It says it can take years to make the decision to act, but once that decision is taken, really it's just a case of implementation, of execution. I will give you the counterfactual just from my own experience. Actually, I have two examples, one that aligns with that and one that absolutely doesn't. My oil and gas major, highly complex company. It took my CEO, I think maybe 15 minutes over dinner to conclude that this was something we absolutely had to do. It took us 6 years to figure out how to execute. And then another 2 more since I've been there to raise our ambition even higher. On the other hand, I was on the board of a much simpler waste management company where it took a year to figure out how to go from idea to execution. So I think it really varies, and we have to be realistic also about how challenging it is to go from concept to execution depending on the complexity of the business model. The thing that I thought was very interesting in this report was an unequivocal call to understand stakeholders. And as you know, there's been recently a debate about how much boards should be tuned to the concerns of shareholders or the broader stakeholder ecosystem. The role of stakeholders in the climate debate is essential, and it is complex insofar as stakeholders influence one another. And there's a brilliant table in the second report, which is entitled The Guide to Climate Stakeholders. And if you look at page 10, there's a great table there that really shows the ways in which different stakeholders influence one another. So by way of example, I used to work in the investment management field, and I can tell you from personal experience that we were very tuned in to what the academic community, community organizations, trade unions, and activist groups, NGOs, were saying and doing, because we were of the view that this affected shareholder value, that this was going to influence customers, employees, communities, regulators, and therefore it was incumbent on us as investors to be very alive to those drivers. And that's an example where, we were very much receiving the influence of these other groups. And you see this in all different crisscrossing ways. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's incumbent on directors to really get to grips with that. It'll be different for every company. I don't think it's particularly complex, but it is important to basically map out your stakeholders, your employees, your communities, your customers, your suppliers, of course, your shareholders, your bankers, your insurers, and so forth, and understand how they are engaging with one another. One of the really interesting challenges of climate change, which has really, in my view, changed the dynamic for what is expected of board directors, is the fact that because it's a systemic issue, because it cannot be solved by, companies just doing one thing and hoping to be done with it, it requires a systemic answer. And it requires boards to think in a systemic way. It requires us as directors to think about the influence that we have in engaging with other parties. It also requires us to listen to what other parties are doing and saying. I'll give you an example. In my oil and gas board, I found myself very interested in what my friends who were serving on auto company boards were saying, because they had a very different view of what was happening to vehicle electrification, for example, than we did. And I was able to bring that into my board and say, you know what? We're missing a trick here, because the auto companies are way ahead of us here, and they're much more bullish on the growth of EVs. And that's just an example of how, companies often have a tendency to think in a silo. And And so being open to those wider stakeholders, in this case, it would have been users of our product, is really critical. Another really important takeaway from this report is the critical role played by reporting standards, which I'm sure none of you will have been able to miss the fact that there's been a real effervescence in the move to bring together reporting standards and create some order out of the chaos that we've been experiencing over the last few years. We've got the International Sustainability Standards Board that was announced at the COP26 in Glasgow, which has been launched under the aegis of the International Financial Reporting Standards Board. And we have the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States, which has recently issued draft climate disclosure guidelines. We, of course, have the EU non-financial reporting directive. There is, and other countries, New Zealand, UK, et cetera, are all moving forward, and there is going to be a need for these things to converge in order for companies to function through this, what could otherwise be a very messy situation. The other main takeaway from here is that it is incumbent on board chairs to drive board competence in this space. And there are various means by which companies attack this. It could be by bringing in an expert, an individual with climate expertise onto the board. But that has its pitfalls in the sense that that person can end up being really sidelined and left to own it exclusively. It's really incumbent on the chairman to ensure that that expertise is imparted to the rest of the board, that the entire board takes ownership of this issue and understands how it affects, for example, the roles of different committees. I, for example, served on the risk committee. This is a central issue for risk. I serve currently on the remuneration committee. It is a central issue for remuneration, both annual and long-term. And my colleagues on the nominations committee are looking at skills mapping and culture and all of these human capital issues where climate change is obviously a central consideration, especially as we work our way through the so-called just transition, ensuring that climate change generates a response that is inclusive and leaves nobody behind, as we say. Critical for the board to drive culture. The board owns culture. The board needs to change its own culture around climate change and then ensure that the company as a whole is embracing that culture of strategic transformation and building the business around a new climate resilient model. Oh gosh, okay, I'm going to wrap up quickly. Skyrocketing levels of awareness, which is driving concern, and rightfully so, on the part of boards about changes, impacts on the cost of capital, rising litigation risk, rising costs of doing business because of regulatory changes, potential bottlenecks in the supply chain. There's an excellent table on page 10 which explains that. And remember that there is fragmentation between stakeholders. It's not like everybody speaks with the same voice. And finally, the third paper, which is called Understanding Decarbonization, has an excellent table on page 12 that I commend to you, which talks about the 4 key lessons for chairpersons. Climate change and climate action will materially disrupt every part of the economy. That is something that not everyone necessarily grasps, and yet is a fundamental truth. Consequently, as fiduciaries, we as directors have an obligation to own this topic. We need to promote decarbonization in our own companies, and we also have to have a positive influence on the entire ecosystem, the entire value chain. We have to apply the precautionary principle because we operate in an environment of extreme uncertainty, and we don't have the luxury of waiting for hard data. There was a terrific quote in here that if we wait for hard data, it'll be too late. We have no choice but to move immediately with what we know. And finally, I want to conclude on the quote from Karl-Henrik Svanberg, which I thought was just absolutely terrific, when he talks about the Volvo Group, and he says, our climate strategy is the agenda. There is no separate agenda. It is nothing but the agenda. Thank you very much, and over to you, Antonia.
Super. Thank you, Karina, for a great overview of those pieces. So now I think is the time where we get to jump into a discussion with a number of great panelists that we have here. Just by way of brief introduction, my name is Antonia Gavel. I head climate change at the World Economic Forum and have been really pleased to collaborate with the teams on these pieces of work, but I think more broadly on really driving this important topic, really how critical the role is of boards and chair people on those boards to drive awareness and action on climate as part of accelerating progress. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce our panel with us here today. We have Sheila Murray, who has served since 2020 as the chair of the board of Tech Resources, also a fellow Canadian. Feike Sybesma, who has, I think, really been a key leader on driving climate action at the World Economic Forum for many years now. So thank you for that. Feike also serving as the vice chairman of the supervisory board of Philips since 2020. And of course, last but not least, Sharon Thorne, chair of the Deloitte Global Board of Directors, and also a key champion in helping drive this specific work forward as well. So welcome to you all. I think what we have is a good amount of time just really to dive into some of the points and findings, I think, that Karina helpfully outlined, just to really get your perspectives and guidance and insights on this important topic for our audience here as well. So maybe Sharon, if I could start with you. You know, as chair of the Deloitte Global Board, would love to hear what you think is really kind of the important point here, right? So why is strong climate governance so important to you in your role, and how has that really driven and influenced the work at Deloitte on this topic?
Okay, thank you, Antonia. It's great to be here. I mean, the science is undeniable. Humanity and the planet is facing an existential threat, and this is a decisive decade. As Karina said, we absolutely have to act now, and it's crucial that we take meaningful and measurable action. And addressing climate change and climate governance is extremely important to me, both on a personal level and as the Deloitte Global Chair. You know, I strongly believe that all businesses have a responsibility to step up, to take urgent action, to transition their own operations, to collaborate, to make and deliver against net zero carbon commitments, and also importantly to talk openly about what they're doing to encourage and influence others. And as Karina's been outlining, and Olivier, you know, chairs and boards have a key role to play in driving that action through interactions with management and other stakeholders, both inside and outside of their organizations, but also by using, you know, our platforms to advocate and agitate for change. And I think boards are particularly well positioned to help their organizations progress. They tend to be more focused on the long term, and given their breadth of experience, can bring more external perspectives. To be effective, boards need to be prepared to ask the hard questions, to challenge where needed, and to weigh up the many climate-related risks and opportunities associated with sustainable investment. Boards also need to ensure that their external reporting on climate reflects the reality in the business. Last year, Deloitte's survey of audit committees found that of the 350 chairs and members surveyed, less than half consider themselves climate literate, and half do not believe they're well equipped to fulfill their climate regulatory responsibilities. And 2/3 say their companies lack a clear strategy on climate. These results are really concerning. Without strong climate governance, we're unlikely to move quickly enough and far enough or seize the opportunities that exist in the global system transition that lies ahead. The majority of businesses need transformational shifts in strategy and or operations and risk management, and the board needs to ensure this is happening. At Deloitte, the global board and committees have input to and oversee our internal climate strategy, and we also oversee our external strategy and the investments that we're making to support our clients with their transitions, and importantly, investing in thought leadership that we're discussing today to help in multiple areas such as board competence. But we have the luxury of being able to leverage our internal subject matter experts to ensure that we're able to ask the right questions of management and challenge, for example, our risk assessment and proposed reporting. And I'm convinced that by increasing climate competency on boards and regularly convening to share learnings and best practices across industries, boards can ensure meaningful climate action both within and beyond the companies they support.
Thank you, Sharon, for laying that out for us, and I think already giving us some good food for thought to dig into. Maybe if I can turn to you, I mean, you've been driving this agenda for many years now, first as CEO of DSM, now sitting on the board of Philips. Sharon, you talked about kind of risks, but also driving questioning in the board. And Feike, maybe if you could give us some thoughts on what are the kinds of questions that in your capacity now you can drive, in your discussions amongst the board to really help progress climate action. What is it that people should be really, pushing forward in that context?
Right. Thank you, Antonia and the panel. I think the first question we should ask is, why do we address this? Why do we address climate change as a company and in the board? And I think that has something to do with our responsibility as companies, as management, as boards. For me, it is obvious, but it is important to hold a second by that responsibility, why you are doing certain things. And that results, of course, that the question is your organization a purpose-driven organization? And if so, what is the purpose then? How and where are you going to contribute to which of the global problems? It means also then automatically that CSR should not be a topic in itself or on the side, but you should integrate as a company, and that is the question of the board to the management, is CSR integrated in our core business and our core operations? And for me, Antonia, why we are doing this is basically to future-proof the company, to make the company resilient towards the future. On many dimensions, future-proof on looking into our own mirror, being responsible, future-proof regarding our employees who will not like if we are not a responsible company or we cannot attract otherwise the right people. Future-proof towards the risks of not addressing climate change, and Sharon mentioned that also. And the risks can be multiple. The risk can be in your own supply chain, if we covered that well. The risk can be on your own locations, your own sites. Are those threatened by any climate change? The risk can be on your employees. A couple of years ago in South Africa, where there was a shortage of water, drinking water. Well, if you really have such a big issue as employees, why would you start working and not stay at home and help your family on those kinds of things? So the risk can be numerous in your supply chain locations and your people. And I think those should be the questions as a board to management. Why do we do this? What about our responsibility? What about our purpose-driven? Is it anchored in the core? Are we future-proof? What about the risk? And last but not least, like you mentioned also, what about the opportunities? Because addressing climate change gives also opportunities. Opportunities, maybe your company has innovations which can be used and sold to other companies or to whoever. Addressing climate change, or you make your business more circular, etc., which Philips is doing quite a bit. So those are the questions, and of course you can go deeper, and maybe we can dive into that later, Antonia. Do you have the right knowledge in the board? Do you have the right competences of doing all this? But this is for me the start of the discussion.
Super, thank you, Feike. I think I heard you say the word risk about 20 times. So that's clearly a key driving factor. How do we ensure that the companies are kind of, proofed against that future risk, which is a critical factor in particular, as we see what the science is telling us in the context of climate change already wreaking havoc on many supply chains of companies as well. So no, certainly we'll dive into that and equally kind of pick up on the opportunity point. Now, I think, Sharon, one thing that you did point out is that there continues to be a significant lack of understanding and awareness of this topic amongst boards. And I think that also means that obviously when engaging with different stakeholders in the boards, it can be challenging, right, to kind of get the message across. And maybe, Sheila, I'd just be interested to turn to you. If you could maybe talk to us about how you engage stakeholders, both within the board, but also more broadly, who may not necessarily have the same degree of understanding nor sense of urgency as well. How are you bringing them into this discussion and moving to action?
So, Antonia, there's no question this is a really complicated issue, I think, for all boards, and one that's been evolving. I think in the 2 years that I've been chair of the board, I've seen an enormous transformation. We used to focus really just on one particular stakeholder group, our investors. They were the loudest, they were the most prevalent, and we worried about them. We'd hear from them, of course, every year at our annual general meetings, and sometimes more often. Now we look at our stakeholder groups much more broadly. We look at our stakeholder groups as anyone who is affected by our business or has the ability to impact our business. So for us, that is our employees, of course, our customers, our suppliers, our partners, the governments in the countries in which we operate have a huge impact. And of course, the communities in which we operate, and for Canada in particular, our Indigenous peoples. Those stakeholder groups have very disparate, very different ideas about what should be being done. They have their own agendas, and it's really hard to walk that fine line and migrate through all of those conflicting agendas. And you're right, Antonia, you said, how do we get our message across? So we're engaging much more directly now with all of our stakeholder groups. Management obviously has primary responsibility, and we have a huge group here that works on stakeholder relations. They engage directly with our stakeholders. They also engage indirectly through reading periodicals, being aware of what is of the most interest and the most concern to those groups, and then trying to educate us as a board so that we understand. Ultimately, our job is to act in the best interests of all stakeholders. And that means sometimes waiting between disparate views, making trade-offs, as you said. This past year, I met with 15 institutional investors and a number of other representatives of stakeholder groups to hear from them what their concerns are. I met with Climate Action 100 representatives, with the Canadian Coalition of Good Governance, with ISS, Glass Lewis. As many people as are willing to talk to us, I'm willing to go out and hear from them and also speak to them. We receive numerous communications from NGOs, investors, potential investors. We respond to all of those, and we share all of those letters, the ones we get, and then our responses with our governance committee of the board to make sure that they're in tune with what we're hearing. At the end of the day, all we can do is listen, advocate, whatever position it is we're taking. And then I think, as has been pointed out many other times, act at all times in the best interest of the corporation. We, as a board, are the stewards of the long-term future of the company. And that may mean that we will trade off short-term profitability to invest in new technologies that give us the ability to solve our climate challenges. There's no question, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but there's no question that in order for all of us in the global community to achieve our aspirational goals in 2025, 2030, and 2050, we're going to be relying on new technologies, and someone has to invest in those. And that is going to be corporations like ours in the extraction industry who have to rely on new technologies to reduce our dependence on diesel, to help OEMs create the electricity get away from combustible engines and create electrical vehicles for major hauling. We have to assist in that journey. And so there will be trade-offs, there's no question. And as we trade off, we have to be clear with our message, and we have to make sure that we believe in what we're doing and we communicate soundly and well so that people can understand why it is we're making the decisions we're making. They won't all be happy, but we're not in the business of trying to make everyone happy. We're in the business of securing the long-term future of tech.
No, thanks for that, Sheila. Maybe just a quick follow-up question is, you mentioned kind of an openness to listening to and engaging with the inputs and perspectives of many stakeholders. I'd just be interested in sort of two things. One is, are you finding that the kind of demands from those stakeholders in the context of climate change are increasing, right? When you're hearing from communities, when you're hearing from your employees, what would you say is sort of the expectation now? And I think particularly with a focus on investors, because we know still that there is a kind of, a strong voice of investors in the context of this conversation as well. What are you hearing from them in terms of their true really drive in tackling climate change, maybe in a way that's changed or not over the past 5 years?
There's no question that there has been a dramatic shift in the importance of climate and climate risk to all of our stakeholders. I think that there's no question it was already of concern to the government as stakeholders and to the Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, where we operate predominantly. But now the real change in the past 3 to 5 years has been the shift among our investing population. And it's no surprise, we're in the extraction industry. We do have fossil fuels. We have coal operations. We are becoming uninvestable in some states, among some groups. We have to address that. People, and I think what's encouraging is we're actually hearing from them rather than having them just trade out of our stock. We're having them approach us and talk to us about and want to understand what our solutions are instead of just selling. I will say one thing that has changed. I met with Climate Action 100 2 years ago. And at the time, we were really getting a lot of pressure to get out of fossil fuels and get out of the bad industries and embrace the green economy. This year when we met, they were quite clear in saying, we do not advocate and we're not pushing you to sell your businesses because we have a fear that in selling those businesses, they may go to a less ethical or climate concerned enterprise. So I'd say that's been a bit of a change. A more recent change is that investors are more realistic in realizing they'd rather have enterprises that are ESG focused and are climate change focused running these kind of businesses than have it go to private equity or others that have a much more short-term focus.
Okay, that's helpful. I want to just quickly pivot a little bit to not sort of put a spotlight on you, but also to put a spotlight on each of you in the context of your roles. I mean, I think any of us working on climate change, of course, feel a sense of responsibility to do what we can do in our own individual capacities based on the roles that we play and the work that we do individually. And I think in that context, the question that I have is, and maybe Feike, I'll throw this one over to you to start, is in your role as chair, how do you and what have you really done to drive action on climate and enhance climate competence in the board? Just to help the audience understand what can the chair really do and drive. I mean, Sheila, you gave us some good insights in the context of kind of stewarding the company for the longer term, having that responsibility as well. But maybe if you could give us a sense, Feike, that would be great.
No, appreciate it. And like I said, it starts with the context of the purpose and responsibility and the opportunities and risk, etc. One step deeper, as chair, take care that the board collectively have knowledge about this topic as competences. And to be honest, many boards do not have the right knowledge yet in the board what this all means. What does it mean to address climate change? What does it mean to anchor that in your company? So that knowledge and experience is important. And then you can make that practical by many things. And Karina mentioned a few. To take care, it's anchored in your strategy. To take care that you know the risks and opportunities. But also to take care that maybe you look to the incentives or the remuneration of your management, that you report and being transparent enough, that you give special attention to this in your board by a committee or by putting it regularly on the agenda. By the way, a couple of years ago, we did on this respect a survey with a group of 100 companies in the World Economic Forum, and we said, for who of you climate change is important? That was almost 100%. We said, who of you are discussing this on a regular basis with your board? It was 30%. Mm-hmm. And we held there and say, okay, do we need to say more? So to anchor that in your structure and to take care that you have the knowledge and discuss it and anchor this in your board is important. Incentives, reporting, strategy, and that you look to what does this mean? And as a board, you're responsible for that, for your different stakeholders. Like Sheila is saying, are your shareholders still with you? Are you addressing this well enough? Are your people still with you, or your future employees? Are your customers still with you? And whatever stakeholders you can look at. And it's important. So there are all kinds of practical things once you have the knowledge to address this. And I think this is of importance.
Super, thank you, Feike. Maybe Sharon, sort of similar question over to you, sort of your individual role, but also how you continue to kind of leverage that in the context of continuing to drive awareness and action.
One of my worries, is that climate competency is still seen as a nice to have in the boardroom. And in some cases, the reality is far worse. So for example, I've heard board directors referring to climate change as mumbo jumbo, which is, unbelievable. And of course, one of the questions is, greenwashing is a concern for many. Greenwashing is designed to make people believe a company is more environmentally friendly or more ecological than it really is, so more natural, healthier, free of chemicals, etc. True greenwashing is intentional. However, misinforming or misleading stakeholders can happen due to a lack of knowledge and proper understanding, and this has to change. And I think, as chairs, we have a responsibility to ensure that we're leading on this. We've been doing a huge amount of work at Deloitte to really, I suppose, improve our governance. And we've been guided by the climate governance principles that Karina referenced. So, for example, Principle 2, command of the subject. We've been doing a huge amount of work with the World Wildlife Fund to produce climate learning for all of our 345,000 people. And we've adopted various interactive tools among our member firms. And we're looking to keep developing and deepening our learning and development offering. And we talk about climate, and I lead on this at the majority of our global board meetings, either as a standalone topic or in relation to the decisions we're making, for example, about technology and other investments. In the relevant committees, we do the deep dives as needed, the Risk and Ethics Committee, the Finance and Audit Committee, and we also leverage the work of our World Impact Council, which I co-chair, and which played a key role in developing our internal climate strategy. Now, I've had several sessions with Deloitte Global Board members to improve education, and we're looking to do even more this summer. But importantly, we're cascading this knowledge through our Deloitte community of chairs who lead the Deloitte boards in our different countries and asking them to cascade to their board members and Deloitte leaders locally. And education has got to be much more than just a tick box exercise. It requires real commitment to outcomes. And just one other thing to think about is board nominations. And Feike referenced it, but the chairs we spoke to recognised their role in driving climate literacy, but warned against making board appointments based on specialist expertise alone. You need appointments to bring in directors with curiosity and who are going to increase diversity of thinking. And we need leaders who are thinking about climate at a more macro level beyond the walls of their organizations. So, you know, there's a huge amount that chairs and boards can do, and we have to lead from the front.
No, some great insight and advice there. I'm just scanning through, and there's a number of really good questions coming in from the participants here. So I just want to pick up one or two of those. There's one here. I mean, what we're talking about here, you know, essentially is the role that you're playing in the board as active advocates of driving climate action. I think the reality is indeed that that's not necessarily the case across all boards. So there's a question here which is asking for any advice that you might have when the chair doesn't actually want to talk about climate change in the board, and when there isn't necessarily you know, support to do so. What are the actions that you might encourage to help this conversation get into the board when perhaps it's not as front and center? I don't know, maybe Sheila, you can kick us off.
Well, let me give that a try. Hard to think about that, but I am now thinking about my role on other boards where I'm not the chair. And, you know, it can be a difficult journey. It's been, you know, tech's been on this journey for a very long time. So as chair, you know, I feel like tech, we've had a sustainability committee for a decade, and it's front and center, and it's probably the most important committee that we have. So for other boards, I'm actually, I've just taken an ESG certificate course. I did it myself because I really felt that it was crucial to get educated, not just as chair of the Board of Tech, but to inform myself to be more valuable on other boards. And now have suggested as chair of the governance committee of another board that all board members, and I'm going to introduce this at Tech as well, all board members engage in continuing education on climate change and ESG. They don't have to take the same course that I took. In fact, it would be better if they didn't. It'd be better if we all took different ones and learned more. I think that's a really important way for board members to take if there isn't leadership from the chair, go ahead and educate yourself. Sign up for courses. I think it is an important risk for the company, and I think most board members will sit on some committee, whether it's compensation or audit or nominations. Each one of those committees has a role to play in assessing climate risk and bringing it to the forefront. So whether or not the chair is involved, that it would be great if the chair was, but as a member of any of those committees, I think you can bring this forward as a topic to be added to the agendas for each one of those committees. It's an important aspect of comp. It's really important for audit. So bring it up that way.
Or any other advice, Feike?
Well, therefore I started in the beginning with the why. Imagine you chairman or many of your board members don't want to discuss it, they don't see the necessity. And by the way, this is not a theoretical question, because if 100% of the companies found it important and 30% is discussing this on a regular basis in board, the question is not theoretical, it's very practical. But therefore start to ask the questions. Are we prepared? What could be the impact? What is our responsibility? Are we future-proof? What about the opinion of our investors, employees, customers, etc.? Ask those questions. And I found it hard that the majority of the board or the chairman will say, well, all nonsense, none of our business. No, then that can't be. Then you don't fulfill your role. But it might be that they don't see that yet from a business perspective, from a continuity perspective, etc. And therefore those questions are important. And it builds, of course, on what Sheila is saying. Is there enough experience and knowledge in the board on this topic? And if that is not the case, you better go to a course or have an advisor or learn from other people or whatever it is. The experience and knowledge in the board on this one is also important.
Super, thank you, Feike. And there's a sort of another question that I'm picking up here as well. In a sense, the link between the board and management. So the management's prerogative on this issue versus the board. Maybe Sharon, if I can sort of ask you to pick up on this one, or others who want to jump in. So the role of the board we've discussed, and the role of the chair in driving awareness, education, et cetera, but equally kind of the link there to management. Sharon and Feike, if you have your hand up there too.
Yeah.
I mean, the role of the board, as we said, is critical, but it's management who are implementing, they are developing the strategy, they are implementing it, they're assessing risks, they're in the day-to-day. They're the people who are actually going to make this happen. And, we need management to absolutely, step up and commit to the actions and also develop the roadmaps. So that, it's management that have to do the heavy lifting and the hard work. So they need to have a great understanding and they need to be committed to it. But the board are the people who are holding them to account, overseeing. We reference the importance of the Remuneration Committee, and so that there's a key role there to sort of be able to hold your executives to account for the targets that they're committing to. One of the challenges is management can come up with what looks like a great roadmap and a commitment to, achieving net zero in 10, 20 years, whatever it is. How does the board get comfortable that those things are achievable? So how is the board assessing what management is doing and the sort of the actual detailed actions that they're taking? And it's got to be a very close relationship. And you'll see quite a few companies now have joint committees between board and management to be able to work on it effectively together.
I would like to build on Sharon, if I may, by saying, the best way to seduce management is that we do not only look to the risks, but that we look to the business opportunities this can bring as well. And of course, they need to look to risks also. But as in Philips, as in DSM, which I was leading as a CEO, we saw huge opportunities in our core business by addressing climate change. We invented a new ingredient which reduces the emissions of methane by cows, or we built in circularity, which gives us a better proposition to our customers, etc., etc. So the moment that you open up yourself also for what we called once a program, climate change induced innovations, the people came up in the company with a lot of innovations. And then you have made sustainability sustainable because you made it to your business model and you earn money by addressing big issues in the world. I think that is important for management as well.
Go ahead, Sheila.
Tony, if I could just wade in very briefly. I agree with everything my colleagues said. And I would add, it's impossible to execute on our climate objectives and achieve those without management. They're the experts, and they're the ones who know the business most intimately and who understand what's achievable and who will design that roadmap. And so management has an extraordinarily important role, the key role in this. We can guide and we can set the course, but they're the ones who have actually got to drive this. This afternoon, we've got a long deep dive session at our Sustainability Committee where we're getting a presentation on the roadmap, our greenhouse gas emission target roadmap. And I've already read the deck. It's a fascinating, incredible presentation where they take us through 25, 30, and 50 and how we are going to do that and everything that they're embracing and what the uncertainties are. And as Feike said, what are the opportunities? Because there are opportunities here.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think this has been a great discussion, and I do have sort of one follow-up question for each of you as we close. But I think certainly what we've heard are quite a range of, let's say, imperatives, right? So one is risk. I think, Feike, you started us off pretty strongly with kind of the importance of risk mitigation, the responsibility that boards and individuals on the boards, but also the companies have to tackle climate change. But I think also importantly, and I can say certainly this resonates, is the opportunity. As you say, you innovate into the opportunity, and this is where we're seeing incredible solutions emerging, not just from the companies, the large companies, but actually also the smaller startups and innovators are coming up with incredible solutions that are really tackling climate change, but also coming up with completely new business models as well, which which can be integrated. Now, I think just to kind of wrap up this part of the conversation, just each of you in just a few words, would love to hear, it's always hard to ask for one action, but I'm going to ask you for one action, but one climate related action that you would advise to those listening, a board member to explore with the executive team. So we just talked about the link between the board and the executive team, but what would you specifically, one action that you would advise them exploring as a starting point? Maybe Feike, over to you to start in just a few sentences.
No, I keep it very short. I give a few words. The question you should ask yourself and in your board is, are you prepared? And answer that question solid and clearly enough, and then take actions. And really do some soul searching whether you are prepared enough. And thanks, Antonia, for leading this session. I know from the World Economic Forum how passionate you are also on addressing climate, and that passion might be important for boards as well.
Great, thank you, Feike. Sheila?
Mine leads off of that, and maybe it's a bit more precise on how are you prepared. And I would say, has the board, the organization, engaged in a comprehensive review of the risks of climate and how they impact the business today and in the future? And do they have a path to mitigate those risks? Because I think until you really think about it and catalog the risks that your organization is exposed to today and in the future, and think about a plan, you are not prepared.
Great. Sharon, last words on this one?
So just I suppose taking a step back and just ask, do you think about climate change and sustainability holistically and systemically? So, UK company law, for example, requires directors to have regard for the impact of the company's operations on the community and the environment. And I remind the Deloitte Global Board of that duty at the start of every meeting as a way of reinforcing the interconnectedness of our actions and decisions. We talk about business ecosystems, but it's important to recognize that we're all connected to the global natural ecosystem, not to mention reliant upon it for our survival. Talking about it in this way may help people to understand that we all have to act very quickly.
Great, thank you, Sharon, and thank you to all for a great discussion, which I think has been incredibly productive and helpful for those watching here. And also thank you to the audience for all the great questions. Unfortunately, we didn't manage, of course, to get through all of them, but we will come back to you with some insights on the questions that you've asked in the chat here. So with that, thank you, and back over to you, Karina.
Thank you very much. A very warm thanks to our panelists for an excellent discussion. The themes that we heard highlighted today, uncoincidentally, are perfectly aligned with the principles for effective climate governance. No surprise there. And so I really want to encourage you to have a look at those. They are really a great blueprint for guiding you and your board on how to tackle these questions. Also encourage you to read these 3 reports. We'll be sending you a thank you note with the links, so you don't need to go digging around for them. They're called the Chairperson's Insights into Climate Action, the Chairperson's Guide to Climate Stakeholders, and the Chairperson's Guide to Decarbonization and Understanding the Decarbonization Roadmap, which is where things get a little bit technical. Do consider joining your local chapter, which goes by Climate Governance Initiative, or in many cases, Chapter 0. If there isn't a chapter in your country, and you want one, let us know, because we're looking to expand. But you can always join other existing chapters nearby or in a convenient time zone or convenient language. Most of the UK chapters events, which are obviously done in English, are open to members who reside and serve in other countries. Many directors, and this was reflected in the Q&A, many directors are interested in director education, formal director education. Do know that the Climate Governance Initiative is very focused on this. The board has a professional education committee. We're working with several of the IODs that host our chapters in the US, Canada, Singapore, Brazil, Italy, Australia, France. These have courses that are in various stages of completion. Certainly the Canadian one is very well advanced. I think it's doing its third cohort already, but the US one was just launched 2 months ago, and so forth. So there are courses out there that you can attend and that are specifically modeled on the 8 principles of the Climate Governance Initiative. And I want to note that all of the chairs who spoke today serve on the boards of companies that are members of the Alliance for CEO Climate Leaders, which is another World Economic Forum working group that is doing a ton of really good stuff. So have a look at the Alliance's website also for inspiration of best practice. And with that, I want to thank our speakers and thank all of you for joining us today. Thank you for your questions, and we look forward to continuing to work with you and hopefully to have you turn up at our chapter events. Thank you.